Now, it seems that Robert Malone has stepped down from the ACIP, which is the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, recently put together by RFK Jr. And you have to remember that if you understand the politics, that the main group that had been there before had been disbanded, and he brought in new people. It has been a difficult time, it seems, and Robert Malone has stepped back and made some choice statements about what has been happening. I'm going to play those for you from a clip from High Wire, and I'm going to make some comments about the difficulties that we're facing when politics is getting in front of science. One of the challenges that we have today is that there is still a real issue going on in terms of understanding the science around the pandemic. The implications are still ongoing. And so I don't think that the scientific and medical community has the luxury of messing around in politics at the moment in order to hold their positions. We really need to do serious work. One of my concerns is that as difficult as it may have been to work with Robert Malone at that time, because he probably asked too many difficult questions, someone like him is critical in terms of aligning direction because of how much he knows. Just a quick reminder as to who the ACIP is. This is the roster, and there's Kimberly Biss. You have here all of the people, there's 17 in total, of which you have Robert Malone here, MD. And here is the summary. So quite a lot of doctors here, some PhDs, Retzif Levy, and he is the adjunct professor, Louisiana State University, vaccinologist. He has a lot of experience with vaccine development, scientist, biochemist, and this one, contributor to mRNA technology. Now, for those who weren't aware, he became quite a controversial figure in 2021 because he challenged the safety of the technology, the mRNA technology. And so he, instead of being given a bit of the Nobel Prize credibility because of the stance that he took, he became persona non grata when it came to the scientific community. So he was absolutely criticized at that time. Now, you may think that this is just, something that I'm reading, but you have to understand where I am coming from. With regards to Robert Malone, my history is that I accidentally was the first video interview with him in 2021. I've put the link in here, The Truth Behind Discovery of mRNA Vaccines. Now, the reason this occurred was just coincidental that he had been talking about at the time, making a lot of points about using repurposed drugs. And so I was talking to him about that. And just prior to me having the discussion, his wife had done a very detailed article about his work with mRNA technology. And so I happened to stumble into it. And one thing was clear, and a lot of people will argue about this, that, yeah, he had some early contribution to the technology, but he wasn't critical, and there are lots of people involved. In that interview, to clarify the point, I did some very specific questions. And the purpose of the questions were to try and understand how did he come up with the idea. And he was able to detail it exactly when, what he was doing, what research happened afterwards, and how the confusion then evolved because he was only a master's student at the time. And in theory, he conceptualized the idea of mRNA vaccines. Now, people may argue about that, but I would challenge them to find anybody else who can do what he did in terms of telling you exactly how this came into being. So this was where it came from. So I have followed Robert Malone for a long time. And so I was therefore very interested in what happened recently. So I'm going to play for you the clip from the high wire, where he was talking to Del Bigtree, and I'll make some points as we go along. So let's listen to this and see what he has to say.
But is it still a hostile environment inside of these regulatory agencies and the government?
Del, it's guerrilla warfare. My comments to Bobby when he called me and asked me to stay on, and I said, no, I'm sorry, I've had enough. I don't think the CDC is redeemable. A lot of those people are very, very entrenched in the safe and effective narrative. And they also, many of these people, they have culpability, in particularly as it...
I pause here. He's making a very important point. Now, one thing is clear about Robert is that he does seem to challenge the authority around him. And based on my interview with him at the time, I could see that that kind of thing happened even when he was a PhD student. And this can cause problems. But it doesn't mean that his science is anyway flawed. And this is part of the problem. Sometimes personality can get in front of the reality about the science. So in the same way here, what he seems to be suggesting is that within the regulatory agencies, they're very entrenched in the ideology about the COVID vaccines and what happened in the pandemic. They don't want to shift their perspective. And he made the point that they could therefore be culpable. And nobody, therefore, wants to have that light shown on them. But based on my research, and this is what I've been doing since early 2020, looking at autoimmunity and the spike protein and so on, the principle is simple. If you look across every single vaccine platform for COVID-19, whether or not it was whole virus, whether or not it was the adenovirus viral vector, whether or not it was protein, whether or not it was mRNA, none of them were particularly effective at stopping this virus. Some had more side effects than others, and this is part of the reason why the adenovirus vaccine was kind of moved away. That's the AstraZeneca. And we had the mRNA vaccines then being the primary ones, but it wasn't necessarily because they were so good. They were better in terms of some of the side effects than the others. But with that said, there was one very important characteristic with regards to mRNA vaccines, with regards to the fact that it seems they've made slight alterations to the spike protein. And I think it made it difficult for the immune system to digest it in some people. And therefore, my observation and my research suggests that you could then end up with longer term issues, especially in an environment where virus is still circulating. That's what I call the COVID storm. Now, we can argue about those things. The main point being, when you have entrenched regulators who don't want to look further at the science, what it means is that you will be stuck with what you have got. Everybody just wants to move on. They don't want to face any of the more difficult questions. Let's hear a little bit more about what he had to say.
Relates to the COVID crisis in terms of suppression of information, manipulation of data. The people that are in there are the ones that have dirty hands. And Bobby's gotten rid of some of them. Now there's something even worse, though, that has been covered in all of this. Is, I'm not going to name a name, but Bobby appointed somebody to be operationally in charge of the ACIP and a number of other aspects of the CDC. And that person appears to have been a mole.
Pause right there. So again, this is where it seems as though there are some issues. And I suspect, because I don't know, there is an important document that got leaked before it should have. And this really seems to have damaged the target that the ACIP was working on. And so they were working on post-COVID vaccination chronic injuries. They wanted an ICD code where people who were suffering long-term with chronic injuries would then have a coding which would then be like a diagnosis. And when you look at the work group, as you go down here, there are a number of people that were involved in this, and they were supposed to help put together the framework. And when I had spoken about this recently, I'd highlighted some very important points that were said. In this document, they have said up to 10% of people reported major side effects. And in a public survey, 24% of the participants reported that they knew someone who had died from the adverse effects of COVID vaccination. These are huge statements. And I suspect that this was probably part of the reason why all of the pressure on this ACIP group was done, because then the court case came up and they then literally were going to wipe away all the decisions that had been made from the appointment of the new ACIP advisory committee, because the court was saying they were not appointed appropriately. And so all of the work that had been done in the past year or so would therefore be discarded. That doesn't sound like science to me. That sounds like politics. But let's hear a little bit more about what he had to say at the time.
The word saboteur has been used.
Wow.
And I warned Bobby about it, but Bobby didn't think that was the case. But now it's come clear from that person's actions that they've done a lot of damage.
So why step down? I wanted you in there. We needed you in there. What made you come to this conclusion?
Yeah, this thing is a hot mess. It's not serving its function. It's really a fool's errand. We put thousands of hours. We're treated like chattel. The disrespect, frankly, from the government has just been longstanding and profound. This kind of, well, we're going to tell you what to say and when to say it. We don't want you to talk about vaccine harms, and we don't want you to recommend that the PrEP Act protection be pulled. They have never provided any cover for us with all these attacks that we've been sustaining. These people have been run through the ringer. They've lost grants. They've been isolated professionally. The government's attitude is basically we're expendable. You've got thousands of hours from 17 highly trained professionals who are taking time out from their practice. This is just absurd. I'm just done with it.
So you can see how upset he is at this point.
Bobby appointed
what has happened. This is a big issue, because he's quite right. This is what Del Bigtree had said, is that we need people like him in this kind of organization to bring some degree of balance and challenge, because it does appear to me that there is no longer any appetite for serious research around COVID, because serious research around COVID would be looking carefully at what we did to try and understand if how it was approached was the best scientific way, and critically, if there were mistakes, what are the health implications going forward for the population? As far as I know, there doesn't seem to be any interest really in anybody anywhere in the world. This is just the United States. You can look at any country that you are in. Any regulator could trigger a similar kind of review and analysis. What we're getting are studies, like for instance, the one I had recently spoken about, where when they look at cardiac arrest in vaccinated versus control unvaccinated cohorts, there is protection for the vaccinated against cardiac arrest. And I'm saying, come on, guys, you know, if you see something like that, that should warrant you looking at the data. But okay, fine. Let's just imagine that the majority of the cohort who were vaccinated didn't have any cardiac complications. It's clearly showing that there is a cohort who had single dose who seemed to be at significantly higher risk. Where's the interest? Why don't you want to understand that? Why is it that they are an acceptable outcome for adverse effects? That's effectively what is happening at the moment, is that there seems to be a cohort who is negatively affected. And that is not misinformation. That is just the reality. You can argue if it is 0.01% or 1% or 10%. The point being is that it does not matter how big or small it is. We should still understand the mechanisms because it could be relevant for the future. I still maintain that this proposed action to look at chronic injuries should be taken up somewhere else. So if it is not in the United States, this is out there. Why can't it be done in any other country? Once it's done once and an ICD code is formed and it starts to measure real outcomes, it's very difficult for anyone else to ignore it. The saddest part about what we have today is that we are now facing a time in science where science no longer asks questions that can be politically difficult. And that for me is therefore not science. That is politics. And sadly, this is where we are today. It would be one thing if at the end of the day, this was purely just about people going back and doing some kind of assessment and looking at the mistakes that were made. That's only one part of it. And some countries are doing this. What they're not realizing is that the implications and the scientific outcomes are still occurring today. And I would bet, similar to what I had shown previously in the UK statistics, we are seeing rising patterns in conjunction with each other that don't make any sense. You know, with hypertension, almost 190% increase since 2020, 2021. These are the kinds of things that are happening. And if we don't look at it, if we don't address it, the outcomes in another 5 years, in another 10 years are going to be absolutely horrific. Hopefully, there comes a time where the scientific community is not afraid to ask hard questions on behalf of the population, because in the end, that's where the advocacy should remain. Thank you for listening. Have a great evening.